It is the night of October 22nd, 1943, and somewhere over the black, cratered rooftops of Kassel, a German night fighter pilot is listening to his headset with mounting confusion. A voice, speaking flawless German in the clipped, bureaucratic tone of a Luftwaffe ground controller, is ordering him to break off his interception and return to base immediately. Thick fog, the voice explains, has closed the airfield at Deelen. Land at once. The pilot banks his Messerschmitt away from the bomber stream he was seconds from engaging. There is no fog. There is no such order. The voice belongs to a young woman sitting at a console in rural Buckinghamshire, and somewhere above the clouds, a lumbering Avro Lancaster is filling the same frequency with a rising, warbling howl that drowns out anything the real controller tries to say. Below, hundreds of Royal Air Force bombers continue towards their target, protected not by armor or speed, but by confusion itself. This is not science fiction. It is one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War, a campaign fought entirely in the space between 2 ears and a radio dial. While historians and documentary makers have spent decades fixated on the machinery of bombs, guns, and armor, a quieter revolution was unfolding in the electromagnetic spectrum, one that turned the very system Germany had built to defend its skies into a source of chaos for its own defenders. This is the story of how Britain learned to make the enemy's own radios lie to him, scream at him, and ultimately betray him. Understanding why this mattered requires understanding the scale of the problem Bomber Command faced by the middle of the war. Germany's air defense network, engineered largely under the direction of General Josef Kammhuber, had grown from a scattered collection of searchlights into one of the most sophisticated integrated systems on Earth. Stretching from the Danish coast down through the Low Countries, the so-called Kammhuber Line divided German-occupied airspace into a grid of boxes, each one assigned its own radar station, its own night fighter, and its own ground controller. When a British bomber entered a box, radar would detect it, a controller would vector a waiting Messerschmitt Bf-110 or Junkers Ju-88 towards the contact by voice over radio telephone, guiding the fighter closer and closer until its own onboard radar, or simply the pilot's eyes, could find the kill. By 1943, this system was working with lethal efficiency. Bomber Command was losing aircraft at a rate that, if sustained, threatened to make the entire strategic bombing campaign unsustainable. Raids on cities such as Hamburg, Essen, and Nuremberg were costing dozens of aircraft and hundreds of trained aircrew in a single night, each bomber carrying 7 young men who would not survive to see morning. Conventional countermeasures helped only partially. Window, the strips of aluminium foil dropped to blind German radar, had proven remarkably effective at confusing the search and gun-laying sets, but it did nothing to stop a controller talking a fighter onto a target once contact had been made by other means. The problem was not simply that the enemy could see the bombers. The problem was that the enemy could talk to the men trying to shoot them down, calmly, continuously, in real time. No amount of chaff could jam a conversation. What was needed was not a way to hide the bombers, but a way to poison the very language the German defense relied upon. The organization tasked with solving this problem was the Telecommunications Research Establishment, working alongside the Air Ministry's Scientific Intelligence Branch and a shadowy formation that would eventually become No. 100 Group, Bomber Support, based at various airfields across Norfolk and Lincolnshire. The approach that emerged had 2 distinct halves, and together they amounted to one of the strangest weapons ever carried into combat. The first half was straightforward jamming, codenamed Airborne Cigar, or ABC for short. Engineers fitted a small number of Lancaster bombers of No. 101 Squadron, based at Ludford Magna in Lincolnshire, with a receiver and 3 transmitters tuned to scan the very high-frequency band the German night fighter controllers used to issue their instructions, somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 megahertz. Once the equipment located an active German transmission, it would lock onto that frequency and pump out a distorted, oscillating tone, a mechanically generated howl not unlike a dentist's drill crossed with a badly tuned violin, at a power sufficient to bury the human voice underneath it entirely. To the German pilot, the calm instructions from the ground would simply dissolve into shrieking static at the critical moment, leaving him deaf to guidance just as he needed it most. What made ABC unusual was who operated it. Each equipped Lancaster carried an eighth crew member, a role that did not exist on any other bomber in the fleet, a special operator whose entire job was to sit hunched over the receiver in the freezing, vibrating fuselage, headphones clamped tight, hunting the dial for enemy transmissions. Many of these operators were German speakers, and a striking number were German or Austrian Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazi regime years earlier and now found themselves flying back into its airspace, night after night, using the language of their childhood as a weapon. Some did not simply jam what they heard. Some listened, translated, and reported back useful intelligence on German tactics before reaching for the jamming switch. The second half of the operation was more audacious still, and it is here that the story earns its name. Code-named Corona, this was not jamming at all but impersonation. At a receiving and transmitting station in England, RAF officers and members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who had grown up bilingual, or who had studied German to native fluency, would listen in real time to the genuine ground controllers speaking to German fighters, then cut in on the same frequency using the same clipped procedural German, issuing false instructions of their own. Break off pursuit, return to base, land immediately due to fog at an airfield that stood in clear moonlight. On occasion, the impersonator simply repeated the real controller's call sign back at him, or read out meaningless strings of numbers to sow doubt about which voice was genuine. The intention was never to convince every pilot every time. It was to introduce enough doubt, enough hesitation, enough wasted seconds of confusion that a fighter crew's attention drifted from the bomber stream even briefly, and in aerial combat, brief was often all that was needed. The equipment itself was unglamorous to look at. The ABC transmitter units were roughly the size and weight of large domestic radiogram sets of the period, bulky, steel-cased boxes that added a meaningful burden to an aircraft already carrying bombs, fuel, and a crew of 8. Ground stations for Corona, by contrast, resembled ordinary broadcasting studios, banks of receivers and microphones staffed round the clock, their operators working from transcripts of captured German procedural manuals to keep their imitation authentic, down to the exact phrasing a controller would use. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to come. Deployment records for both systems remain frustratingly incomplete, a consequence of wartime secrecy so tight that many operators did not fully understand each other's roles even within the same squadron. What is documented is that No. 101 Squadron flew ABC-equipped Lancasters on the majority of major bomber command raids from late 1943 onwards, their special operators logging dozens of successful jamming interventions per major raid, moments where a controller's transmission was demonstrably overwhelmed mid-sentence. Aircrew testimony from the period describes German fighter pilots audibly cursing on open frequencies, unable to understand why their orders kept dissolving into noise. Corona's effectiveness is harder to quantify precisely, since success looked like nothing happening, a fighter that simply failed to find its target, but post-war interrogation of captured Luftwaffe personnel confirmed that German controllers grew so suspicious of impersonation that entire procedures had to be rewritten, with authentication code words introduced specifically to counter the British voices on their frequencies. Germany was not blind to the threat and attempted its own countermeasures, but its approach never matched the integration Britain achieved. German engineers developed jamming of Allied bomber communications and experimented with deceptive transmissions of their own, yet the scale, the linguistic sophistication, and above all the sheer organizational nerve of running native German speakers inside RAF bombers over German soil went unmatched. The Americans, arriving later to the electronic warfare fight, adopted broadly similar jamming principles for their own daylight bomber formations, but never developed an equivalent to Corona's voice deception, partly for lack of sufficient German-speaking personnel, and partly because the United States Army Air Force's daylight tactics relied less heavily on defeating a voice-guided interception system than on massed defensive firepower. In this narrow but crucial corner of the air war, Britain's combination of linguistic infiltration and brute force jamming had no real peer on either side of the conflict. The material impact of these systems is difficult to state with precision, and honest history must acknowledge that. Bomber Command's loss rates did decline across the period these countermeasures matured, but so did many other factors simultaneously: improved fighter escort, better route planning, the sheer weight of window deployment, and the crumbling of Germany's broader air defense infrastructure under sustained pressure. What can be said with more confidence is the psychological toll. Interrogations of captured German night fighter crews after the war repeatedly mentioned distrust of their own ground control network, a creeping paranoia about whether any given instruction could be trusted. That in itself represents a form of victory rarely captured in loss statistics. An air defense system is only as good as the confidence its operators have in it, and by 1944 that confidence had been deliberately, systematically eroded from thousands of kilometers away. The legacy of this campaign stretched far beyond 1945. The principles pioneered by ABC and Corona, locating an adversary's communication network and either drowning it in noise or subverting it with convincing deception, became foundational doctrine for electronic warfare throughout the Cold War and remain recognizable in modern signals intelligence and cyber operations today. Surviving examples of the ABC equipment can be seen in aviation museum collections in the United Kingdom, including preserved Lancaster instrumentation displays, though the fragile recordings of Corona's spoof broadcasts themselves have almost entirely been lost to time, their content known now mainly through the written recollections of the operators who once spoke into that microphone. Return for a moment to that October night over Kassel. The pilot who broke away from the bomber's stream never knew the fog warning was invented in a hut in the English countryside by someone who had grown up speaking his own language. The controller who screamed into his own microphone, straining to be heard over a howl he could not explain, never learned that the noise was manufactured 8,000 meters above him by a refugee who had once called Germany home. Neither man ever saw the weapon that had defeated him, because it was not a weapon in any conventional sense at all. It left no crater and pierced no armor. It simply took the enemy's own voice and turned it into a stranger, took his own frequencies and turned them into noise, took the very system built to protect German skies and quietly, invisibly, made it lie. Britain did not always beat Germany with bigger bombs or faster fighters. Sometimes it beat Germany by understanding, more deeply than the enemy understood himself, exactly how his own machine worked, and then reaching inside it to pull a single wire loose. The bombers kept flying. The cities below kept burning. And somewhere in the dark, a German pilot kept asking his radio a question it would never honestly answer again.